Christian parenting.
And so, in the context of adoptive families or foster care families, this idea of, again, emphasizing this idea of structure, let's have a set of rules, and here's how we govern ourselves, is just one of the most powerful things, coupled with this idea of repetition.
Hey, families, welcome back to the Called to Love podcast. As each week, we dive into the practical, the clinical, and always, most importantly, the biblical aspects of the adoption and foster care callings. Today, I'm really looking forward to this conversation as we're going to be talking about the eternal significance of adoptive and foster parents. And, this sounds like a really weighty topic, and actually it is, because what we want to remind you of today is that the fact that you are a foster and adoptive parent is incredibly significant to the kingdom of God. And we need that reminder in the midst of the hard days and in the midst of the mundane as we are living this parent life. And so joining me to encourage you in this truth is author and speaker Bill High. Bill, welcome. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Really glad to be here with you.
Absolutely. So tell us a little bit more about just your family and your ministry work.
Yeah, so I grew up in a very poor home. My dad was the oldest of eight. They lived in a 3-room log cabin in the hills of the Missouri Ozarks, kind of down by where you live now. But anyhow, we were very poor, and we had 6 kids. I was 5th out of 6. We were a poor welfare family. So that was our background. Pretty tough. So I understand the heart of the father, because I was probably 8, 9 years old when somebody down the street brought a children's Bible story book. And that's really how I came to faith, is through somebody that had planted a church in a small town and was out sharing the gospel with us as a poor family.
That is amazing. And now that has inspired the work that you do centered around families. Tell us a little bit more about that.
So one of the things, of course, that maybe you've heard is this idea is that wherever your greatest wound is where the flower grows. And so because I came from this very tough background, I actually have a journal way back to that time where I said, man, I want to have a great family. And so that was one of the earliest stages of just really wanting to be part of working with families. Now, it didn't turn out, it's never a straight line. So I ended up going to undergraduate school, getting a degree in education, thought I was going to teach and coach, but ultimately applied to law school. And the last law school I applied to was the University of Kansas. They gave me a full ride to go to law school. So I'm like, God must be thinking that I want to go to law school. So I did.
Right.
Went and practiced law 12 years, big law firm. It was a good experience, but had always felt like that my call was to tend the flock of God. Just didn't know what that was or what that meant ultimately, but moved into actually working in the inner city world. So as you appreciate, we saw a lot of broken families in the inner city back in the day when I was involved in that ministry side of it. It was something like 92% of the families were single moms, multiple kids, multiple dads, and just the fracture of the family. So a lot of foster care, a lot of adoptive issues. We worked with a pastor who was on the verge of adopting a child out of the foster care system, had the kid for 4 years. And then at the last minute, a relative swooped in and took the kid.
Wow.
So crazy kind of stories just working inside of the inner city. But ultimately that led to moving into the charitable foundation world. And then that led to ultimately the work that I do today, where I've got 2 sides, 2 hats that I wear. So we have a family legacy ministry called Legacy Stone. We create small group curriculum for the church. And then additionally, I do some direct consulting work with family businesses, helping families make that generational transition from one generation to the next.
I love that. And I love just to appreciate the fact that you share the different aspects of your story. And I can share that similarly, where I started is entirely different, from where I am now and where the Lord has led. And so and I think our listeners can relate to that too. A lot of times they've found themselves as parents to children that they never anticipated. That might be a kinship type situation. It might be similar to, something that you were describing in your work in the inner city. But the Lord has led us to this place where we have ultimately influence over children in our homes, ultimately to point them to the gospel, and to establish that legacy of faith. And that is your heart. And that's why I really want to dive into this with our parents today. We are in the day in, the day out, the mundane, the just caring for kids, and then the caregiving needs, and then we add in these elements of trauma and generational sin and generational struggles and that kind of a thing. And so with that, we can forget the eternal significance of the calling that has been placed on our lives. And so where do we begin unpacking that kind of a topic? But one of the things that you share about just on your website, as I was studying some of your material, you talk about how every parent, regardless of their status or influence, can build a lasting legacy through faith, family, and purposeful living. So let's start there with purposeful living. That can be really challenging when we're in the day in and day out. So how do you advise families and counsel families in being purposeful towards that eternal significance perspective?
Yeah, it's a great question. The thing that we always say is that every family can have this 100-year kind of legacy.
Mm.
In our Western culture, we don't tend to think about it that way.
Yeah,
But if you think about the biblical design, nobody starts out having a family and thinking, boy, I'd sure like to mess up those kids. That's not
yeah,
the goal.
that's right.
God's design really is that families would be multi-generational in nature. Psalm 78, verses 5 through 7, talks about this whole idea that our fathers should tell their children, who would tell the next generation, the children yet unborn, even the children yet to be born yet. That's 5 generations. And that's really the picture. And so your question is, well, what do we do? How do we do a better job of succeeding? And ultimately, we say it's pretty simple. You need to define your family values. We say that you typically need to define the 3 to 5 family values that will provide protection and attraction for your family. That's what values are. They're both protective. They're saying, hey, we don't go that way. And they're attractive in that they provide identity because they say, this is who we are.
Yeah.
So a typical set of family values might look like faith, family, integrity, gratitude, generosity. It's an acronym, FIG. But that idea of just defining your family values is often the first step. And then you've got to teach them, articulate them. Deuteronomy 6, talk about
Yeah.
them when you're lying down, when you're rising up, when you're walking by the way, and then post them on the door plates of your home. I showed this before we went on. We encourage families to write it down, get it put together, and then post it on the wall of your home. And it just becomes that kind of compass setting. So a simple vision, mission, values kind of statement is one of the first keys. And one little aside to this is that people sometimes hear this, think, oh, well, that sounds like business. But the truth is, we often are far more intentional about our business
Yeah.
than we are about our family. We treat family as something that's fun, but kids are expensive, so don't have too many kind of
Yeah.
idea.
Yeah.
But the biblical idea is that kids are a heritage from the Lord, and this is how we set in motion. This is how we try to redefine legacy. Legacy is what you set in motion for that day in heaven, where we'll all be together. But back to that idea, Abraham, if you remember, of course, he's promised land, people, and blessings. But by the time he gets to what, Genesis 13, 14, 15, he's tired because
Right.
he doesn't know how he's going to ever see all this happen. But God gives him vision. He takes him outside and says, say what? Abram, look up, see the stars. That's what your family's going to be like. And that's
Yeah.
the power of vision inside of
Yeah.
families, is that when we live with vision, you can imagine Abraham night after night, anytime he's discouraged and he goes outside, said, that's what God said I'm going to be like.
Yeah. That's so good. Oh my goodness. So many great truths that you shared in that. And how to unpack all of that. I think I love that idea of vision and establishing that. And you talk about being very intentional with our businesses, and a lot of times that is true as we go about our days. And then sometimes our families, when we have that quality time together, they get our leftovers because we are fatigued from our days. And there's a lot of intense caregiving, there's a lot of paperwork, there might be court hearings for our foster parents, there might be therapies, related to all of that. And so you're taking care of all of the practical, and sometimes we miss nurturing that spiritual aspect. So, Bill, what are some practical ways that we can just take time? And it doesn't have to be extensive, but it just in our day to day, what are some practical ways that we can take time to nurture that vision and establishing that identity of who we are as a family?
Yeah, so we say that if all you did was get your 5 family values down and then you write them down, We had one family, they had young kids, so they put it in laminate. So that way it could sit at the dinner table and they could make a mess of it. They could draw on it. But it just became a topic of family conversation. And the idea of having a regular family meeting is what we talk about. You need
Yeah.
to have at least a weekly family meeting. If you got little kids, if you got adult kids or teen kids, it might be every other week. If you got adult kids, it might be when they're around. So maybe it's
Right.
once a quarter or once a couple times a year. But that family meeting that says, let's remind ourselves about what God's done in our lives. So reflection, storytelling, the reminder of the values. And if you think about it, there's 7 celebrations in the Bible, and that time is a time to pull away from work, to rest and to reflect and say, hey, what has God done in our life? And of course, the
Yeah.
principal celebration is the idea of Sabbath, which is weekly. Same
Yeah.
kind of idea. Let's pull away, rest, reflect, remind ourselves of what God's done. Let's fellowship together as a family.
Yeah, that's so good. I love that. And we do the weekly family meeting, and it is becoming increasingly difficult because I now have a young adult who's in college, and we capture him wherever we can because he's busy and experiencing that new season of life. But there's been so much value over the years for us to be able to do that. And one of our statements that we know and that's identified us as a family, just as an example for you listeners, we say Colberts do hard things. And because we want to teach our kids to persevere and to lean into the challenges that are inevitable in life. And so trying to just establish that as a part of our identity as we push through and we lean into the Lord through hard things. And so maybe take a moment to start there, friends, with your family around the dinner table the next time you gather to just kind of get ideas from one another. Ask your kids, make it a fun time of engagement with your family to start there. I think that's a really great and practical suggestion, Bill. I love that. I'm thinking about the families that, ideally a lot of our families we adopt a newborn. That was our story. And so we had our daughter from the get-go. We were able to instill those from the very beginning. But a lot of our families, that's not their experience. That's not their story. They have kiddos who come into their lives and into their homes at different ages. And so they may come with different experiences, different worldviews, maybe not even any kind of introduction to God and to the Christian faith. And so, what would your advice be, just in practically speaking, ways that our parents can begin to instill and introduce our kiddos to these principles, the biblical principles, in a way that doesn't overwhelm them?
Yeah, I mean, we say, let me back up and say there's 3 big buckets we think of thriving family. The first big bucket is built around the idea of relational health. How is everybody doing? And then with that relational health, is it a safe place for conversations?
Yeah.
Is it a trusted environment? But then the second big bucket is this idea around structure. What's the structure? And because we're talking to so many families who have adoptive kids or foster kids, structure is key.
Yes.
Because so many times those kids are stepping into environments or they're stepping out of environments that are totally unstructured. It's
Right.
chaotic
Yeah.
and they're looking for order. So structure is one of those simple things. And so we say, in terms of structure, one of the things is built around the idea of the regular rhythms, daily, weekly, monthly as a first start. So is Monday night, Monday night's family night, Friday night is fun night, Sunday is worship night. But just saying these are our nights during the week. And the daily rhythm is we wake up with scripture, we close with scripture, or we close the day with a story. But the idea around rhythms becomes really important. But then within those rhythms is you have this overarching idea of the vision, mission, values. But then the other element that we say somewhere is to add on this idea of the family code of conduct. And the code of conduct are really the rules of behavior. So it's not just an ethic, it's not an aspirational, but the code of conduct are very simple things like we don't yell and scream. We lower our voice, we lower our tone. And typically we say families should have about 5 to 7, maybe 12 rules of behavior that are really simple. Don't gossip. If you have a problem, then we're going to be direct. We're going to be honest. Summer,
Right.
I have a problem with you. I'd like to talk to you about that.
Yeah.
And so just some really simple rules of behavior actually, again, give you something that you can point to and say, hey, this is what we agreed to do. My wife and I, by any means, did not have this all figured out when we first got married. And we've been married for almost, we're on our heading towards our 39th year. We have 4 kids, 3 are
Congratulations.
married, we have 5 grandkids. But we did start out with some very simple rules, code of conduct. And one of them was very simple, which is we will communicate. And so what that meant, you appreciate this in the early days of your marriage, sometimes you get mad and you want to shut the door and it's like, I'm not going to talk to you. Well, she'd pull out that rule or I'd pull out and say, no, we agreed we will communicate.
Yeah.
And we agreed, for instance, that we will not go to bed angry. And we agreed that we will deal with the hurts. And we'd agree that we seek restoration.
Mm,
So those are just some powerful guidelines that when you have those that are up and everybody agrees to them, it governs really the rest of your life.
yeah. That's fantastic. I love that about prioritizing communication. And that's key as you're establishing trust with children who are coming into your home from different experiences, like you talked about, most being chaos. And so to introduce them to this, the stability that that offers and the legacy that it establishes. I'm curious as you share your family story, how you've seen that play out as you and your wife learned that and then that became the governing principles of your home, how that's played out as your adult children have now had children and so forth and so on. What has been your experience in that?
Yeah, I mean, it's never perfect by any means. And so you still have to give yourself plenty of grace in all this. And so one of the rules that we say too in this is we say that it's always your first time. It's your first time as a parent, your first time to
Yeah.
have a 1 year old, it's first time to have a 20-year old. And so to say, hey, it's okay that it's
Yeah.
your first time. But then likewise, to be able to come back and say, and I'm going to give you grace and all that. So yeah, we do have adult children now. We do have now our oldest grandkid is 10 years old. He's a great little guy and it's fun, but we're having to work through some of these same principles with them. But they can point up on the wall of our home and they can say, that's
Mm.
who we are.
That is really amazing. I love that. And that's beautiful. And I love that you bring up Deuteronomy 6. That's one of my favorite parts of scripture and just that whole principle and the beauty of how the Lord lays that out for us to design that for our families. And we know, Bill, that our kids are coming to us as foster and adoptive parents from those broken places where that doesn't necessarily feel safe for them because chaos is all they've ever known. And so to bring them into homes of order and structure and expectation can really um, escalate behaviors and resistance in a lot of ways. So, what, in your opinion, would be some good advice just to encourage those parents who are dealing with the pushback of these values that they're trying to instill in the kiddos in their homes?
Yeah, I mean, the one of the things that we know from Jewish culture is that it's a culture, originally it was an oral culture. So the law was passed down, the 10 Commandments were passed down by speaking it. And
Yeah.
then it was repeated and repeated and repeated. Some of the literature, the reading that I've read about that Jewish culture and why it's successful even today. I mean, if you've been to Israel, you understand that Sabbath is like the whole nation of Israel shuts down. And then when Sabbath ends, it's a giant party. And
Yeah.
that's a nation. So think about that. But where did that nation begin? It began as a family. And it
Yes.
began, what, a couple thousand years ago. And they're still celebrating a practice that they started all those years ago. And so, in the context of adoptive families or foster care families, this idea of, again, emphasizing this idea of structure, let's have a set of rules, and here's how we govern ourselves, is just one of the most powerful things, coupled with this idea of repetition.
Yes.
Repeat, repeat, repeat. That's what Deuteronomy 6 is about. Deuteronomy 6 is we're going to keep repeating this and keep repeating this. And again, some of the adage in Jewish culture is by about the 101st time that it might stick. That's the mindset that we have, is that we have to say, we're going to keep fighting here and keep fighting. And even in the foster care situation, even if that's only for a season, we don't know the seeds that we'll plant.
That's right.
We by the way, I didn't mention this to you, but we have a new book coming out called The Legacy Life: Leading Your Family to Make a Difference for Eternity. We were doing that with David Green of Hobby Lobby. But there's a really fun story that I think is worth repeating, particularly for this audience. And it's the story of a missionary, true story, guy named Dr. William Leslie. Truly was a doctor. He came to Christ and then said, I'm going to give my life to missions. Met his wife actually while he was sick. She nursed him back to health, so they got married and they went overseas, and they were missionaries in really a remote part of the world. And, you think, wow, what a great story, but it wasn't. It was horrible because they went
Yeah.
over there and they ministered, they travel around from tribe to tribe, and they had zero fruit, none.
Hmm.
And so you think, okay, maybe they just weren't very effective, whatever it was. But the point of the story is that the tribe people came to them at one point in time and said, you know what, this is not working. You need to leave. So he did. He and his wife left. They went home depressed, and he died about 8 years later. He
Hmm.
thought his life was a failure. Now, this is really encouraging story so far, right?
It's
Well,
great.
here's where it's really powerful. About 80 years later, there is a group of missionaries who go back to that same area. And when they go into that area, what they find is a group of thriving churches, plants here and there. And even one place had this like outdoor, amphitheater so they could hold large gatherings. And they asked them, they said, how did this happen? And they're like, well, it was some guy, William, or some guy, Leslie. Well, it was Dr. William Leslie,
Wow.
who 80 years before had planted the seed for a church to get born. They just didn't get to see it. And so for the parents who are in the trenches with these kids, adoptive kids, your own kids, the foster care kids, keep repeating. You
Yeah.
may not see the fruit, and that's okay. Our job is not the fruit. Our job is to be faithful. And
That's
if we are
right.
faithful, just like a Dr. William Leslie, we may not know the power of the legacy, the story that we're setting in motion, but we'll get to see it in heaven.
Mm, that is an incredible story, and how appropriate for us as we do. I love that you say keep repeating, because there are days where it just does not feel like you're making any progress. But ultimately, wrapping our brains around everything that you shared and going back to this idea of the eternal significance of our listeners, of foster and adoptive parents. I love that you say we're not responsible for outcomes, that we are just responsible for our obedience and saying yes. I need that reminder today, and I know our listeners do as well. That is so, so helpful as we are living life in the trenches. And it is so helpful also just to have practical tools like you offer in your ministry. Bill, I want to make sure that our listeners hear about those practical tools that can just help come alongside them. Maybe they're like, I'm overwhelmed. I am just surviving moment by moment as I'm doing all the things for the kids in my care. So I need some supportive resources to help me to establish the things that you're talking about today. Tell us a little bit more about those resources.
Yeah, we recognize our target client, if you will, target person is that young mom in many cases who's just like, man, I'm just trying to keep, everybody fed and happy and
Right.
all that kind of stuff.
Yes.
So we've created a video series that people can go online. They can take it individually, or they can do it as a small group, but they watch a video. And now we think the small group is really ideal, of course, because they'll do this in community with other families who go
Yes.
through the same thing. And then they can end up with the same kind of product, where you end up vision, mission, values, code of conduct. And that's the two series that we have out right now. Is we have this one really that drives the vision, mission, values, and then the other that drives the code of conduct and conflict process. So those are a couple ways you can get the materials. Legacystone.com. You can, as I say, take the course as an on-demand kind of course. You can do it as a small group kind of program. So those are a couple ways. And again, we recognize, and by the way, it's one of those things too, where there's a lot of circles, fill in the blank. We give people a lot of things so they're not having to come up with it out of thin air. But it does really give you the roadmap for how you'll navigate some of these seasons with family, but also how you'll navigate conflict.
Yes, that is fantastic. And I love that you bring up conflict because that's inevitable in our broken world, broken humans who love broken humans. And so that path to reconciliation and then just implementing those biblical standards and values in our home is just it's so important. And we don't want that to be missed in the midst of this calling that we have said yes to. Bill, I want to give you the opportunity just to close out with a word of encouragement for our listening audience who are in the trenches. Most of us, they are either in a waiting season, they are in a high caregiving need season, and they're just really, maybe some of them are just waiting on the Lord to show himself as faithful to their obedience. What word of encouragement would you leave us with?
Yeah, one of the things that's really powerful in the scriptures is you see how many times God looks at some of these broken, desperate situations. And number one, he says, I see you.
Yeah.
And not only does he say, I see you, but he takes those situations and he turns it into something really good.
Yeah.
And again, I could go through story. We have actually a whole chapter in our book called The Broken Legacy that talks about all these stories in the Bible. Do you think, how can anything good come of that? It would just take David and Bathsheba, a relationship that starts in adultery, conspiracy to murder, public shame, and the whole bit. And yet Solomon's born ultimately out of that relationship. And a
Right.
temple is built, and for a time, a period can worship God at the center of their nation. And it's within that seed that ultimately leads to the person of Christ. So God always takes those situations that we look at and we think, how can anything good happen? And he turns it to good. That's just his nature.
Yes, that's such a good word. That encourages me for sure. Listeners, I know you're encouraged by Bill as well. I want to make sure as we close out today that you can share with us how we can learn more about the work that you do, the book that you shared about. Where's the best place for us to go to find out all that information?
Yeah, if they go to legacystone.com, they can see me, the work that we're doing, and then they can, there's also a landing page for the book, so they can order the book. The book, by the way, when we did this, we realized that people might want a accompanying devotional that has all the scriptures behind it. So there's actually a 90-day devotional that's available as well, but it's all available at the website, or certainly you can go to Amazon, or you can go to your nearest Hobby Lobby and find it there too.
I love that. Hey, see, there's an excuse to go to Hobby Lobby. You're welcome, friends. I love
Yeah.
that. That is so fantastic. Okay, I will have those links in today's show notes. And you know that this show is all about offering you resources, families, as you seek to thrive in the calling that the Lord has given you and to just offer that obedience day in and day out. We want to come alongside you and give you the best possible way to do that. And so, Bill, this is a perfect example of that. And I am so grateful that you've taken the time to share your story and your ministry with us. Thank you so much for being my guest today.
Yeah, happy to be here with you.
Thank you so much for listening to Called to Love today. I love to hear from listeners, and so I would love to connect with you to hear your stories and answer your questions right here on the show. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram, send me a direct message, or send me an email at the link in today's show notes. I pray you have been encouraged by today's episode to walk in faith and continue to embrace your own call to love. Until next time, blessings, sweet friends.